So, at the left of the screen is a artist's representation of a bipedal ape-like ancestor from which humans emerged with a sort of pretentious name, Australopithecus. And at the right is us. Homo is our genus name, humans. We're going to argue that humans, the original proto-human, evolved around 2 million years ago, a simple but profound new trick. It accidentally evolved the capacity to manage and control the conflict of interest problem, something no other animal has ever done. Now we're all aware of conflicts of interest, nepotism in politicians and that sort of thing. We tend to think of conflicts of interest as kind of a peripheral nuisance, but not a central issue. That's perfectly wrong. Conflicts of interest are to social behavior what gravity is to cosmology. They are the central fact of all social behavior in all animals at every moment, in every era, in every species. So the social behavior of every species, including our own, is determined by how we manage that problem. As we'll see as this story unfolds, humans have learned to manage and control this central problem, conflicts of interest, as no other animal ever has. And from this, everything else about us will emerge. The good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak, will emerge from this. Okay? So let me give you some hints about how that might work. We speak. Other animals do not. As we'll see later, other animals communicate, but we speak the way birds fly, with elite skill. No other animal does that. That, in fact, turns out to be an adaptation to the social exchange of information between large numbers of individuals. It becomes adaptive. Why? Because we can control the conflict of interest problem. Our brains are large. We can invent the calculus and write symphonies and leave footprints on the moon. Genetic change is required to create those large brains. Is it sufficient? It is not. It turns out that those large brains are just expensive, dysfunctional pieces of hardware unless they have access to vast amounts of culturally transmitted information. Humans transmit massive amounts of culturally transmitted information. We're doing it in this room at this moment, in fact, as a result of what? Our ability to control the conflict of interest problem. If I lie to you, you can make me pay for it. If we're non-human animals, you can't. That simple little trick is extremely profound. We're going to call it back several times over the next few minutes because it's this trick of socially generated and transmitted information that is ultimately the reason the world looks so different to us than it does to a non-human animal. It's the reason we can understand ourselves in ways that non-human animals never will. And it's the reason that we can do all the spectacular things we do, like build wind farms and leave footprints on the moon. This is the central thing we do. And in this central trick lies the key to a vastly more peaceful, richer, more humane human future, by the way, as we'll return to in a moment. But let's dive in. So conflicts of interest and their management explains our large and powerful minds, adaptation to expanded streams of cultural information, speech in order to exchange that cultural information. But a good theory will also predict things that you hadn't expected. That's one of the symptoms of a good theory. It shows you things you didn't imagine. Let me give you an example of one such thing. So we will first use the fossil record to time travel back in time to 2 million years ago. And we'll ask whether the first humans arose under exactly the circumstances our theory predicts. We'll find out that they do, but let's look at some other payoffs that it'll have here now. So this is my favorite family on Earth, my wife and our children. This is Joanne's favorite family on Earth, her husband and their children. But in fact, these are paradigmatic, iconic of the way most of us grew up, right? Most of us, I grew up in a family, I loved my parents, they loved and cared for me. I love my children, I love and care for them. Most of you grew up in a similar environment. I know who my father is, so do my children. This is cross-culturally universal, by the way. If you're born in Japan or Pakistan or Brazil or Hawaii, you're just as likely to live in a family of this general form as if you're born here in North America. That led anthropologists for a long time to assume that pair bonding for purposes of reproduction was part of human uniqueness. And humans do pair bond. We're evolved for it. We fall in love, right? That's a psychological adaptation to pair bonding. So it seemed reasonable. It seemed possible. Our theory predicts something else. Our theory predicts that our reproductive adaptation is not to monogamy per se. It is to child rearing in a cooperative human village. to borrow the famous African aphorism that was turned into a book title, it takes a village to raise a human child. So we cooperate with large groups of non-kin to raise our children. No other animal does that. Our theory predicts that that, and that only, is the unique human reproductive behavior. It follows from that that humans will mate monogamously or promiscuously, depending upon other variables in the environment, which we'll explore later. Now that's a prediction that's foreign to us in this room because we've grown up in an environment where humans mostly choose something approximating monogamy. But if you look at the ethnographic record, humans don't always make that choice. And often in the ancestral past, they did not. That has all kinds of sort of cool scientific implications, but it has personal implications too. You and I have sexual minds and bodies that are designed to mate monogamously in one set of environments and mate promiscuously in another set of environments. So our sexual anatomy, and more importantly our sexual psychology, is highly complex, ambivalent. And of course you all know subjectively that that's true, right? Anyone in this room who claims to have a simple sexual psychology is lying either to us or to themselves. Our sexual psychologies are very complex. That's expected. And as you'll see, our evolution, this theory accounts for that and gives us unprecedented insight, by the way, into one another, so that our understanding of ourselves and others of both the same and opposite sex is vastly improved, as we'll see when we go forward. So, first point then, our theory is quite successful in not only accounting for the individual properties that we're aware of, but also in predicting some individual properties that we would not have anticipated. That would be cool if that were all the theory did. It turns out to do much more than that, though. It turns out to predict how our history unfolds. And let me give you a couple of examples of how well that works. And I have two goals here, to show you that the theory really does work. It's worth your time to understand it because it's enormously successful. But also because understanding how human history is predicted by this theory gives us the insight all 6 billion of us need to make choices for the human future that are wiser than the choices we made in the past. Okay? All right. So this is a vineyard. This is a cornfield. Most of you probably are aware of, but haven't thought about, that if you take the domesticated plants and animals that feed us away, almost all of the 6 billion people on planet Earth would be dead within 2 to 3 weeks. A few million would remain. We are utterly dependent on these plants and animals. Corn, soybeans, rice, wheat, so on. Cows, pigs, chickens. And yet, all of these came into existence just 10,000 years ago. Humans have been around for 2 million years. In fact, we've known this for a long time. These events are referred to as the agricultural revolution. So for 2 million years, a few million or a few tens of millions of people lived on Earth, scavenging, hunting, gathering wild foods. Then, boom, around 10,000 years ago, suddenly, agricultural revolutions, plural, occurred. Let me emphasize that. This is a simple global map, 3 of many agricultural revolutions that occurred. 11,000 years ago in the Middle East, this is the famous Fertile Crescent that all of us who grew up in North America learned about in grade school. A few thousand years later, East Asian agricultural revolutions occurred, producing rice and millet, other things. But there were also independent agricultural revolutions in the New World long before Europeans ever arrived. All of them occur on a very short time period. Anthropologists have recognized this since before Darwin, and all have struggled to explain it, all unsuccessfully. It turns out that our theory predicts and accounts for these agricultural revolutions extremely powerfully. They are, in fact, an example of a recurring phenomenon called adaptive revolutions, which we'll talk a lot about, where humans suddenly start having all kinds of new capabilities they didn't have before. Historically, genetically dominated thinking was, oh, this must have been a genetic event. Well, given that it occurred independently in the New World and the Old World, not bloody likely. In fact, we're going to argue that it's a social event, and it's a social event that we can understand really, really well. This adaptive revolution, these adaptive revolutions, and all adaptive revolutions in the human story have a single underlying cause, and it is simply the repetition of the ancient human trick. Remember, we're a one-note hula hoop, a one-trick pony. Each of these adaptive revolutions results from an expansion of the scale of our unique social cooperation. That's it. No genetic change, no new belief systems or insights, expansion of scale. And because we generate insight and expertise and share it, the scale of our social cooperation determines what we can achieve. A Neolithic village is not going to put footprints on the moon. 250 million tax-paying Americans will put footprints on the moon. What we were able to do is scale dependent. I can't overemphasize the importance of that. First of all, the evidence is extraordinarily clear, and it allows us to test the details of our theory, as you'll see when the time comes. But it also tells us something else profound. Human potential is not limited by or fundamentally dependent on our individual properties. Individually, we are relatively weak and ineffectual and puny. Our power comes from collaboration, from cooperation. That also means that our ultimate capabilities are limited only by what? By the scale of our cooperation. We will argue that the scale and logic of our cooperation has just begun to fulfill the human potential. The wealth and technical power and sophistication that you and I enjoy today pales in comparison to what our grandchildren and great-grandchildren might in fact be able to achieve, and we're going to argue in fact that we know how to do that. So as we look at another example, a couple more examples quickly of these adaptive revolutions, have that underlying message in mind. The human potential is limited by what? The scale and structure of our social cooperation, period. And by managing the scale and organization of our social cooperation, we control our future. And as the theory unfolds, you'll see that the way we can do that is in fact quite transparent. Okay,